Hey, David, I know you've been heavily involved in the current political campaign. I was just listening to a quote from Pastor Robert Jeffress, who says what others are saying. Hey, look, the emergence of Donald Trump now, it's very similar to Ronald Reagan, and they're real parallels. And the Sunday school teacher, Jimmy Carter, was not the good president. Ronald Reagan, who had been divorced, who was a Hollywood actor, whose wife was into astrology. Hey, we would have discredited him, but he was the man. Parallels to Donald Trump. How do you feel about drawing parallels between Ronald Reagan's ascension and Donald Trump's ascension?
I think it would be a good parallel if Ronald Reagan also had strip clubs, if he also ran casinos, if he also cussed in public, if he also was an admitted serial adulterer, if he also talked about how many women he had slept with, if he also, if Ronald Reagan did all that, it might be a good comparison. But to say that Ronald Reagan was a liberal in his day, that he was twice married, I mean, there is no moral comparison at all. There is no religious comparison at all. Ronald Reagan was one of the most outspoken pro-Bible presidents we've had. We can't even get Trump to be able to know what the second book in the Corinthians series is. And a guy who is, I'm a good Christian, but he's never asked for forgiveness. How do you become a Christian without asking for forgiveness? So those who are making that comparison, I think, now they may support him. That's fine. Welcome to America. Support your candidate. But don't liken Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. There is absolutely no valid comparison there, unless you just want to say he's twice married and Trump is thrice married. All right, maybe that's your comparison.
Right.
That's the best you can do. That's not good.
Yeah, and Ronald Reagan famous for his humility, and Donald Trump famously proud of his pride. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's a good way. Proud of his pride. That's right.
Hey, listen, I know you've got to run to other engagements, but I do appreciate you coming on and all the work that you're doing.
Love it, Michael. Thanks for what you do, brother. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much. All right. God bless. All right. So as tomorrow is Super Tuesday, it's going to be a momentous day, in particular on the Republican side. Now, Pastor Robert Jeffress has recently come out and endorsed Donald Trump. I know he had appeared with him earlier. Then I saw a video where he said he was not endorsing any candidate, or at least that he had not given an endorsement at that point, but then apparently has openly endorsed Donald Trump. And I just want to interact with his comments, because people have said, look, Lance Wallnau, who talks about the church's influence in the culture and things like that, Lance Wallnau has said that God is raising up Donald Trump like a Cyrus kind of figure, even though Cyrus was a pagan king. God used him to restore the Jewish people from captivity in Babylon and to rebuild the temple, and that Donald Trump is like a divine wrecking ball. And others have said he's being used like a trumpet of God, and God's raising him up for these various purposes. Is it possible God's raising him up to judge America? Could be. Is it possible God's raising him up to bless America? Could be. Is it possible he won't be the president at all? Could be. Either way, what I know is what's on my heart, what I need to speak to and address. Max Lucado, respected Christian author, has raised his concerns as Donald Trump passed the decency test. And I can say this with surety. Already, things on a negative level have happened nationally. Public discourse has been lowered and lessened because of Donald Trump's style. Anger and fear has been appealed to. Irrational support has been drawn to the point that almost nothing that he says or does will alienate his followers. That certainly concerns me, deeply concerns me. But let's interact with what Robert Jeffress had to say. Clip number 3.
The fact is, I believe evangelicals have had a huge paradigm shift in what they're looking for in a candidate and in government as a whole. You know, there was a Bloomberg poll that asked South Carolinians, 72% of whom were evangelical Christians, which candidate best represented their values. Donald Trump was at the bottom of the list. But then they asked these same voters which candidate would be best to challenge the establishment, fix the economy, keep the nation safe. Donald Trump was at the top of the list. It's not that evangelicals have given up on their values, but they no longer believe that government can uphold those values, especially after the same-sex marriage ruling last June. And so what they're doing is they're saying, let's let the church and individual Christians uphold these principles that are very important to us, but let's let the government solve other problems, which is why they're open to a secular candidate like Donald Trump.
All right, so with all respect to Pastor Jeffress and the great good that he does and the courageous stance he's taken, I fundamentally differ with those statements. Number one, why, seeing what happened in the Supreme Court, would you not elect someone that would appoint the right people to the Supreme Court so that we could have a turnabout? That's one thing. A second thing is, how do we say, okay, we'll elect a president who doesn't stand for our values and who will then use the bully pulpit of his presidency to not stand for our values and perhaps to bring America down in the eyes of the nations in terms of our values, but he's going to fix the economy and security. And don't we need God's blessing? We're going to continue to slaughter the unborn and do everything we're doing, and God's blessing is going to be on our nation? All right, it goes a little further. Let's listen to one more clip from Pastor Jeffress.
But historically, evangelicals have voted based upon, their values. So you're saying it's almost a different paradigm now, that it's about security, it's about a leader. And wouldn't you say that, it's Barack Obama who's kind of changed that paradigm, given where, people want the outsider today?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of parallel, Judge, to 1980. Remember in 1980, the economy was in shambles, the military was falling apart, we had 50 hostages in Iran, and that year Americans had two choices for president. The first choice was a truly born-again Christian who taught Sunday school in his Baptist church and had been faithfully married to one woman. His name was Jimmy Carter. The second alternative was a twice-married Hollywood actor who, as governor of California, had signed the most liberal abortion bill in California history and whose wife followed astrology and used it to influence him. His name was Ronald Reagan. Guess who the evangelicals went for? They went for Ronald Reagan, not because he was the most religious candidate, but because he had the quality they thought was most important, and that is leadership. And I think that is what many evangelicals are looking to right now. They're looking for a leader.
Yeah, again, with respect to Pastor Jeffress, and these are two separate interviews. The first one was Fox and Friends yesterday, and the other was with Judge Jeanine on Fox 2 days ago. As my guest David Barton rightly said in the first hour, you really can't rightly compare Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump in any shape, size, or form. You really can't. And especially Reagan with his self-effacing humility and Trump's pride of being proud and boasting about his adulteries and things like that, and not even sensing a need for forgiveness for how he's lived in the past. And look, my other concern is that Donald Trump will vacillate from one day to the next. I mean, completely change positions. Diametrically opposite positions one day to the next, and his followers have no problem with it. And come up with complete fantasy lines. Maybe the IRS is targeting him or auditing him because he's a strong Christian. That's fantasy. That's complete nonsense. No one in his or her right mind believes that for a split second. Or that he reads the Bible more than anybody. That he said at Regent University. So when you have a complete vacillating person who will use all kinds of vulgarities to attack others, he gets upset with former Mexican President Vicente Fox for using the F word, said, I'd never use that. This is what he said. So my concern is the blind following of a salesman who Marco Rubio's branded con artist. If he's elected, I'll pray I'm wrong about everything. And maybe once elected, he'll get wonderfully born again and be the greatest president we ever had. I'd rejoice. Trust me, I'll say it again. I said it the last hour. I would be thrilled to say, boy, I was wrong about all my concerns. I felt I was to raise them, but I was wrong. Look at what God's done. I'd be thrilled to say that. But friends, I'll continue to sound the alarm. Until then.